Alright, you human filth, you first world scum, you dirty peasants. Long live my educational dictatorship. This is World Solution Writing Process Podcast. I just finished typing in one of my composition notebooks. So I have these composition notebooks that I write in, sort of in a stream of consciousness, free-flowing style. And then I type it in to a computer in hopes of eventually organizing those fragments into something more coherent. But first, I just type them in, and then I read all the random fragments to you. And for about the next month, it's going to be random fragments. This will probably be a shortish episode, followed by hopefully another soon. So let's dive into these fragments. Get some comedy, because sometimes the big daddy has to be the big baby, and the big baby has to be the big daddy. Anyway, from the chapter, How the Movement Grows Over Time. We have concentric circles. We have ideologists in the center, surrounded by organizers, then protesters, and masses from the center outward. The National Endowment for Democracy, which is an American bipartisan agency for spreading democracy, will fund color revolutions in other countries. And they do cadre building in the same way that I'm talking about, where they build cadre for sort of liberal democracy revolutions using things like nonviolence trainings and teaching them the theory. So I'm just saying we need to do that with a different politics in our own countries. Next fragment, the chapter on combat. It's important to distinguish between a regime change combat organization versus a guerrilla warfare combat organization. A regime change military operation is like a one-time thing. It is kind of a military, but it's more like a task force for one specific incident. A guerrilla warfare combat organization is way longer in its scope of how long it's supposed to operate and exist. Again, it's like a task force versus an army, debatably. I mean, both technically armies, but with very different durations. Anyway, Capitalism is Bad chapter fragment. Apparently U.S. homelessness has been up 12% since COVID. I need to look that up, get some sources on that. Fascism chapter fragment. The entire Trump movement consists of fascists who need to be rounded up, and the only force capable of this would be a socialist state. Alright, the wealthy need to be tarred and feathered. We gotta melt rich people's faces like Raiders of the Lost Ark. Anyway, from the chapter Declaration of National Refoundation. The world is in a transformation process. The crises we are now experiencing are the prelude to a grand social transformation. What human being on planet Earth is not a tragic figure? Next fragment, Class versus Identity chapter. If we cannot convince socialists to pursue economic transformation and the political regime change necessary to achieve it through a realistically feasible method, then the species is simply lost. We have no choice but to continue taking a hard line on the class versus identity debate, enduring the recurring isolation and ostracism which ensues, and continuing in this stance until the cadre and the masses are won over by the necessity of our position, and our absolute stubbornness, rigidity, and intransigence in upholding it. There is no alternative to this difficult course of action, which alone will bring about the economic transformation which is existentially necessary in the short to mid-term future. Okay, I have a side note. Apparently at the Battle of Trenton Christmas Massacre, 80 people were killed. Alright. Anyway, next fragment from the chapter National Refoundation. Many American radicals, due to constant media focus on the figurehead of the president, see the president as some kind of dictator against which Congress is some kind of subversive representative body of the people. Nothing could be further from the truth. Instead, Congress is the central tyrannical capitalist oligarchy, of which the president is either merely an extension or a co-equal capitalist tyrant. However, this does not mean we should indulge some anarchist fantasy of abolishing all legislatures, instead replacing the capitalist legislature with a democratic socialist legislature by a non-electoral popular action of regime change. Next fragment. Comedy. How much artillery does it take for a man to call bullshit? Apparently an awful lot. Next fragment, chapter Why Regime Change. In many ways, the labor struggle under capitalism is simply unwinnable, even in immediate practical terms, and therefore to lead the labor struggle means to organize a democratic socialist revolution. Next fragment, Parallel Government chapter. The purpose of a, quote, revolutionary party, unquote, is to seize power and rule in a socialist government. And the fact that modern revolutionary parties forget this is why no one joins them. Okay, comedy fragment. The future of the human species rests on our shoulders alone. Then I have a stage direction to make fart noises. So the way that's supposed to be performed is, the future of the human species rests on our shoulders alone. Hope you enjoyed that. Next fragment, combat chapter. The Battle of Trenton featured house-to-house fighting, which is like a continuous succession of breach and clear maneuvers, room by room, house by house, street by street, and then, in other contexts, city by city. In the rural setting, it's more about taking road by road and town by town. Class versus Identity chapter fragment. Presumption of innocence for the accused was a basic human right fought for in the English, American, and French revolutions. Next fragment, combat chapter. In the developed world, it's not a matter of piecemeal struggle for territory, but winning over the whole of society through persuasion, parallel government, the anti-government protests and labor strikes in the struggle to win over the security forces, and removing or disbanding the old legislature. Next fragment, class versus identity chapter. Most of the left is liberals throwing a tantrum whenever they're beaten in elections by conservatives, and it has a powerfully distorting effect on the anti-capitalist movement. I gotta blow my nose. Next fragment, combat chapter. For now, the military task would not be the initiation of a guerrilla struggle, but simply the formation of a militia, yet even this is secondary in importance to the formation of a parallel government and anti-government protests. Next fragment, why regime change chapter. Anti-government protests don't have to be violent, only opposed politically to the legitimacy of the ruling regime, whether it be a legislature or a dictator. Next fragment, National Refoundation chapter. All the energy gets funneled into fighting the Republicans, and none is left over for fighting capitalism. Next fragment, Class versus Identity chapter. While some advocate a socially conservative socialism, such as the MAGA communists or patriotic socialists, it's also possible to have a socially centrist or center-left socialism. We can be economically far-left and socially center-left, or even economically far-left, socially centrist. Next fragment, Class versus Identity chapter. Modern anti-capitalists seem to hold each other to an impossible standard of conduct and principles that any of us could uphold in reality only if we lived in post-capitalist material conditions. And the fact that we uphold this standard is itself an extension of our inevitable bad behavior under capitalist conditions. It seems we can neither stop harming nor canceling each other, and due to free will being a medieval superstition, it seems our material conditions mean we should expect such dysfunction to continue until capitalism is long over. Next fragment, Parallel Government chapter. Members of the legislature should make an oath of office, placing their hand upon the Bible, a copy of Marx's Capital or some other Marxist text, or the rulebook of Dungeons and Dragons. It can be as simple as, I state your name, as a member of the revolutionary legislature, swear to uphold the well-being of the people. Parallel Government chapter fragment. A distinction can also be made between lawmakers or other officers of the revolutionary government who may not vote on the laws of the revolutionary government, but who swear themselves to the service of carrying those laws out. We can end and begin clauses with, be it henceforth proclaimed, in various declarations and resolutions. Fragment from chapter Main Veins of Marxism. In a certain sense, Third Campus are like pirates plundering Trotskyism's legacy on the high seas, fully aware of what we are doing and making no apology for it. Ooh, okay. Here's a fragment that's a little longer. In this fragment, part of the chapter Multi-Party Socialism, I compare and contrast anarcho-communism versus radical democratic socialism. And yes, there's a difference between radical and revolutionary democratic socialism. Revolutionary is how we get it, radical is how far it goes in its structure. But anyway, let's start comparing different criteria. Presence of a formal government, anarcho-communism, that's a no. Presence of a formal government and radical democratic socialism, that's a yes. Nationalization of economic sectors in anarcho-communism, that's a no. Nationalization of economic sectors in radical democratic socialism, that's a yes. Some of them. Retention of government agencies in anarcho-communism, that is a no. Retention of government agencies in radical democratic socialism, some of them may be retained. Retention of professional security. In anarcho-communism, no, they all get wiped out or disbanded. Retention of professional security in radical democratic socialism, probably some of them, at least in my model of it. However, expansion of security role to the people in anarcho-communism, that's a yes, and in radical democratic socialism, that's also a yes. Massive redistribution of wealth, that is a yes in both anarcho-communism and radical democratic socialism. Economic rights such as food and housing, that's a yes in both anarcho-communism and radical democratic socialism. Worker ownership of workplaces. In anarcho-communism, that's fully. In radical democratic socialism, that's mostly, because there's also some nationalization. Democratic management of workplaces, that's a yes in both anarcho-communism and radical democratic socialism. An economy coordinated by workplace delegates. In anarcho-communism, yes, fully, that's like the only model of coordinating the economy. In radical democratic socialism, it's more like partially, with some economic planning happening by the next category. Economy coordinated by administration. In anarcho-communism, that's a no. In radical democratic socialism, that's partially. The war on drugs abolished. That's a yes in both anarcho-communism and radical democratic socialism. Surveillance on pro-capitalism insurgents. In anarcho-communism, none of that is possible. In radical democratic socialism, at least in my interpretation of it, that's a definite yes. Reduction of surveillance on the public. That should be a yes in both anarcho-communism and radical democratic socialism. Massive reduction of the working day. Again, that's yes in both systems. And right to political expression, at least for anti-capitalists, that's a yes in both of those systems. All right, glad we got through that. Now we've got more fragments. Class versus identity chapter fragment. Class hierarchy is an economic asymmetry which stands in opposition to the classical virtue of moderation. Fragment on parallel government chapter. We can build a parallel government through games. Main veins of Marxism chapter fragment, which also covers punk rock, because punk was Marxist before it was anarchist, you poser. Punk is neither fully detournement nor recuperation, situationist terminology, but the conflict zone between them. Class versus identity fragment. The economic hierarchy is the first that must be abolished in order to make possible the abolition or reduction of the state hierarchy, and to make possible the abolition of identity oppression. Parallel government chapter fragments. We have a self-appointed adhocracy in a parallel government. Anyone can self-administer an oath of office of their choice, or in the presence of witnesses, or having someone else administer the oath to them in private or in front of any number of witnesses, including at a public event or gathering. If you live in an oppressive dimension of the multiverse, you can base your parallel government in another dimension as an interdimensional provisional government in exile. You can also host interdimensional governments in exile in your dimension, should you wish. Chapter fragment, how the movement grows over time. We can perform oaths of office and declarations of the formation of the parallel government, as well as repeated public declarations of the existence of the parallel government for the purpose of outreach and spreading awareness of the existence of the parallel government. Next fragment on the chapter, parallel government. The Continental Congress in many ways began the Revolutionary War by forming itself. Even if some hostilities broke out before the formal Declaration of Independence, the point is that the Congress did not wait until the war was won to organize a legislature. The Chinese Revolution, on the other hand, waited until its civil war was resolved before holding the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. So this fragment might go in the fascism chapter or maybe the geopolitics West in the rest chapter. Capitalist campaigns of anti-corruption are intrinsically corrupt. Only radical democratic socialism is true anti-corruption. Next fragment, parallel government. Alternately, you can make a statement promising good public service known legally as an, quote, affirmation, if the term oath strikes you as too religious or superstitious. To take such an oath may be spiritual, religious, or superstitious, but an oath can also be understood as a secular political act, in our case, of nonviolent revolution. We are all the Doom Guy, we are all the Master Chief, we are all Space Marines. We will win because millennials are all adrenaline junkies raised on first-person shooter video games, and we're being driven to revolt by how boring capitalist reality is. Next fragment. Multi-party socialism. I need to remember to include arguments against primitivism and not simply anarchism. Anyway, that was more a note to myself than a fragment. Sorry. Parallel government, chapter fragment. You can build a parallel government as a dispersed adhocracy, encouraging individuals to join even if they are in total geographic separation from each other. Okay, how the movement grows over time, chapter fragment. We can pull people in through role-playing games, then parallel legislature simulations, which are also a sort of role-playing game, then education and formal parallel legislature formation. So you think I just want to play Dungeons and Dragons with you. Little do you know, I'm trying to get you to form the revolutionary government with me. Anyway, next fragment from the chapter Main Veins of Marxism. The special combination of Lenin's concepts of dual power and the workers' councils as a parallel government, fused with Trotsky's accelerated timeline of socialism immediately following democracy, were the central twin theories which made the Russian Revolution possible. Next fragment from the chapter How the Movement Grows Over Time. Initially spread the idea over the internet, and possibly build the parallel government over the internet. But look for people who live in or near either major cities or other advantageous locations such as edge cities. Anyone anywhere is fine as long as they can build a circle around themselves with a socialist discussion group or a role-playing game group, as well as other socializing. Local organizers can hold discussions with basic themes such as what is socialism. Next fragment from the chapter on combat. The key in the developed world is to get the population to conceive of its own class struggle as a national liberation struggle, but this doesn't preclude crowd revolution still being more effective than guerrilla war, even in the modern national liberation context. Alright, class versus identity fragment. There are various studies claiming that human nature is not intrinsically selfish, but if this is the case, why hasn't humanity already overthrown capitalism? To spare each other the pain and sorrow of living in it. If we're going to succeed, we need to plan realistically, and to be realistic means to accept that the laws of social motion are driven by material and economic self-interest. To mobilize the masses sufficiently for regime change, we will have to promise them economic redistribution instead of social justice moralism. Alright. Tell me you love me. Tell me I'm perfect. Tell me I'm a big baby. Next fragment. Change of government. We may have to take first responder infrastructure, such as fire departments and hospitals, not only police departments. Parallel government, chapter fragment. The most dangerous part of January 6 was that the participants believed they had the authority of government behind their actions, in their case in the person of the outgoing president, and this gave them extreme psychological determination. Through forming a revolutionary legislature, we can achieve that same high level of purpose and urgency. Make a note to myself for the change of government chapter to look up news articles on recent stormings of presidential palaces, which has been going on a lot in the last 5 years, globally. Another fragment for the change of government chapter. We got a few. In a certain sense, we have to take over everything and prioritize the most decisive first, like workplaces, seats of government power, and infrastructure, as well as media and communications, central banks, and police stations. To coordinate all this obviously takes a much more well-oiled machine than anarchist-style non-hierarchical organization could give you. Depending on centralization in the extreme, with a chain of command, with authority being assigned to either a commander or a committee with a leading individual, plus a line of succession in case leading individuals are rendered unable to operate, for example by being arrested. And to be clear, I'm saying there needs to be in each individual unit of the project. Okay. Next fragment, West and the Rest Geopolitics chapter. It would seem obvious that socialism will work better in countries with the technology than those without it, so we should probably focus on the countries where socialism will function well, not the ones where it will struggle with underdevelopment and real scarcity. Next fragment. Your frustration will eventually force you to mock the audience, at which point you will have achieved Dada. Alright, so the time is running out. Accelerate Now chapter, which is the intro. I've got some death stats on death. So if there's about 260,000 third world deaths per year, which I'm going to have to find where I've got that stat, from starvation, that means someone in the third world starves to death every 10 seconds. In the United States, about 60,000 people die per year from lack of health care. That equates to 1 every 10 minutes. And in America, about 20,000 people still starve per year, which amounts to 1 every 40 minutes. Fascism chapter fragment. America has arguably been at least partially crypto-fascist since the JFK assassination. Class versus identity chapter fragment. Rather than the primary form of racial oppression, racist policing is instead an outgrowth of economic racial oppression, and an unavoidable response to the continuing crisis in the black community which this extremely intense poverty brings. Next fragment, combat chapter. The tactical orientation toward police has been our biggest downfall, as if simply making low-intensity warfare against the police through rioting and defunding would alter the situation fundamentally, instead leading either to subsequent reinstatement of funding, as well as an economy collapsing lawlessness, which does not benefit the working class. Instead, what is needed toward the police is governmental dual power, i.e. parallel government, altering the context in which police operate by forcing them to contend with an alternative government with very different politics. If low-intensity warfare is your game, then governmental dual power is the ultimate nonviolent fourth-generation warfare, often defeating the enemy without firing a shot, in the style of Sun Tzu's Art of War. In the Revolutionary Dictatorship chapter, I have a fragment arguing that Paul Verhoeven, the director, has subconscious authoritarianism, whereas Frank Miller has subconscious anti-capitalism. I think RoboCop might have been both of those working together. And Trotsky during the Russian Civil War was like something between Judge Dredd and RoboCop. Some comedy. My goal is to become a human robot. Why shouldn't I? Bleep, bloop, blorp, human bio-robot. I'm here to treat the audience how it deserves to be treated. Fragment on multi-party socialism. Anarchism is a personal character flaw, but then so are Stalinism and liberalism. Next fragment, strategy chapter. The corporations and the super wealthy may own the state, but under pressure and with encouragement, the personnel of the state can revolt and shift their loyalty. That is something I wanted to say on this episode, even though it's not in these fragments. It's in a later writing. I was looking at Erica Chenoweth, who is someone who has been writing about nonviolent revolutions. And she compares and contrasts violent and nonviolent revolutions in sort of a quantitative, data-driven study. And what she observes, and this is key in my opinion, critical, is, well, first off, she uses this terminology, which I think is really helpful to explain the sort of, Gene Sharpian concept, which she does cite Gene Sharp, so it's not coming out of nowhere. But she uses the term loyalty shift, and she pluralizes it with loyalty shifts. And the contention she makes, which is a really impressive, incisive contention, is that nonviolent political movements are more likely to produce loyalty shifts within the personnel of the state, whether it's the civil bureaucracy or the security forces, than violent movements. And she acknowledges that some violent movements also do create the same type of loyalty shifts, but she's got some statistics that point out that it happens way more often with nonviolent movements. I think that's really impressive. Also, in a later paper, because that one was back from like 06 or 08, in a more recent paper, she says that the number of people in your movement is not necessarily the key factor in whether your movement succeeds. And she also sort of like woefully notes that nonviolent revolutions have been becoming less successful because all revolutions have been becoming less successful, in my opinion, because of the lack of political clarity in them, which is a different issue that I don't think she really covers. She's not really looking at, should these anti-dictatorship revolutions follow Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution and immediately follow up their democracy revolutions with socialist revolutions? Erica Chenoweth is not really covering that. But, the one thing she is covering is she's saying that you can have a smaller movement as long as it specifically targets persuading the security forces. It may succeed with fewer people than a larger movement that fails to do this. Because some people just have this completely unscientific idea that violent struggle is somehow more materialist. Nonviolent struggle, you're withholding your labor, you're disrupting flows of traffic through street blockades, even if they're nonviolent street blockades, like just a sit-in on an intersection. That's material struggle. Persuasion can even be material struggle. If the security forces will shoot you, but you convince them not to, how is that not a material struggle? How is that not a material difference? That's really important. So, thank you for listening to my off-topic rant. Critical in my opinion. But anyway, more fragments. We're coming up on the end. Capitalism is bad, chapter fragment. Every city in capitalism is a forced labor camp. You've got more. A quote from Rumi, the Sufi Muslim poet, for the chapter How the Movement Grows Over Time. He says, "You are not a drop in the ocean. You are the entire ocean in a single drop." For the parallel government chapter, I make a note that there is already something calling itself the World Parliament, and it is not the same as the United Nations. Alright, final fragment from the Main Veins of Marxism chapter. Essentially, we should analyze humanity as if it is a species of deterministic biological robots. This is the scientific approach, there being no scientific proof of free will. We should assess the main motives of we, human biological robots, and admit that if we are material beings, then our primary motives for social action are often material, with materialism applied at the social level equaling economics. Well, thank you for listening to my stream of consciousness writing process. I'm going to try to get all my writing done in terms of getting my handwritten notebooks transcribed into digital form. I'm going to try to get all that done by the end of this month. And I got 300 pages of written notes left to do that too. That's annoying. And I'm going to try to make an episode out of every one of them. I might just have to skip some and just focus on the typing and writing. But I don't really want to. I want to do these fragment episodes. So it's going to be nothing but fragment episodes from here till the end of June. And it's going to be a lot of them, hopefully. Maybe one every 2 days, maybe one every day. I don't know. It's going to be a random schedule according to, what my work process allows. But anyway, this has been World Solution Writing Process Podcast, episode 23, signing off.